Thank you. It's wonderful to be back. I feel a certain kind of bond coming back to Stanford, and I was trying to find a way to express it, and I thought I would use this little slogan we give around the time of marriage. I want to talk to you about something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. So, let's start with something old. There's a familiar distinction between public and private. I want to think about the distinction between public and private goods. So public goods, for example, like defense. Private goods like, for example, underwear. Underwear, defense, typically publicly provided. Underwear, private goods, typically privately provided. Some people take that distinction and make a generalization from it. Generalization is something like, we should be publicly providing all public goods, privately providing all private goods. But of course, Adam Smith long ago taught us to recognize the fallacy in that. It was actually Bernard Mandeville before him in this book, The Fable of the Bees, but we weren't going to build a whole discipline on top of the title Fable, so we forget Mandeville. We talk instead about Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, in his work, The Wealth of Nations, describes the way in which someone motivated by perfectly private motives could nonetheless be providing a public good. As he describes in this famous passage, he intends only his own gain, but is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. And the end which he promotes is the end of providing a public good, a competitive economy that maximizes wealth, as later economists showed us it would. So this suggests that sometimes we can get the public good with a purely private motive, even though not always, showing us that the anarchists were as wrong as the, I intended socialists, but then I realized Sovialist is actually a better idea, Soviet-like idea here. So the anarchists are as wrong as the Sovialists. We don't have to have either extreme here. We can have a system which provides both in the mix. Sometimes a public good without the state. Okay, that's the first idea. Here's the second. Take this old idea. I want to skip new for a second and go to borrowed. And I want to borrow something from this man, Dan Bricklin, who was the creator of, in partnership, VisiCalc. Bricklin, in the early 1990s, re-taught us something that Adam Smith had taught us in Wealth of Nations. Bricklin did it in a much shorter form, this essay, The Cornucopia of the Commons. And the context of Bricklin's discussion was the excitement that had grown up around the creation of Napster. And that excitement had a certain rhetoric, if some of you remember it, the rhetoric of this extraordinary thing that had been built. My friend Cory Doctorow captures this in many of his essays as the description of the largest library of human creativity ever assembled. And the suggestion was somehow we had been moved by a collective spirit to produce this huge, wonderful library. A collective spirit that envisions this socialist, Sovialist idea. Bricklin said, no, this was complete bullshit. It was bullshit that this collective altruistic idea had produced this reality. He suggests no altruistic sharing motives need be present to explain the construction of this extraordinary library in the context of Napster. There was certainly a public good, the public good of the largest library of human creativity ever assembled, but as Bricklin described it in Cornucopia of the Commons, it was a byproduct of people getting what they wanted. Because Napster's default in the architecture of the code, the default was that your music is shared. You get to get music, but all the music on your home directory will be shared by default with everybody else in the rest of the world. And it was that default that produced the public good. No altruistic sharing motivations need be present. It was just this default. And the same point, Bricklin said, could be made about the other thing that was dominant at the time. This is the original logo for it. You can tell why it didn't survive very long. The CDDB server, eventually acquired by Gracenote. This was the server where you could put a CD into your computer and it would check with a central server to identify the CD. And if it didn't have it, you would type in the information of that CD. And as Evan Williams early in this process described, the best way to design this was to design it so people use the data they enter, thus increasing their incentive to get it right. And we know Evan Williams must be right because Evan Williams eventually gave us Twitter as the original CEO of Twitter. But once again, here we have an architecture where the public good was being produced as a byproduct of a private good. Public came from me getting what I wanted. Now, it's not quite public. Right? In all of these cases, it's actually a corporate good that was being produced as a byproduct of an individual good, a corporate good. So, for example, Google, wonderful search engine, which takes the information we provided as we search and uses it to produce a better search engine. So individual good, we get good searches, produces a corporate good. They get a better search engine. Or Apple, in its genius architecture, takes the information about the stuff which we like, or all of us like, and uses that big data to produce better recommendations for us about what we might want to buy. An individual good, no doubt, but produces a corporate good. Or Amazon, it's the same structure. Individual good produces this corporate good. Netflix, the same structure. Individual good produces this corporate good. Facebook, in its core, it's the individual good of the connections Facebook enables, producing a corporate good, an extraordinarily valuable corporate good for the owners of that corporation. In all of these cases, the corporate value is being produced by individual effort. This public corporate value is being created by private volunteers as a byproduct to their volunteering. Now, in my book Remix, about 5 years ago, I talked about this. I said, of course, we should recognize there are these two economies out there, a commercial economy where people are trying to make lots of money, and there's a sharing economy where people are just trying to share their creativity with others. But between these two, there's something we should call the hybrid economy, which is one of these two leveraging the other. So the hybrid economy could be the commercial entity leveraging the sharing economy, or it could be a sharing entity leveraging a commercial economy. Either way, the point is it's a hybrid because it's using both. And as I observed in Remix, this hybrid is not unproblematic. It raises a series of questions about what the appropriate relationship is between the sharing economy and the commercial economy. Malik, early in this process, asked the question, does this culture of participation build businesses on our collective backs? Begging a question of social justice. If there's a question of social justice in the liberal state, increasingly we have social justice in the Facebook state. What is the relationship between this corporate value and the private contributions that have produced it? And is it a relationship that reminds one of a kind of digital sharecropping environment? Now, I was surprised when I raised the questions in Remix that they were basically ignored by everybody at the time. Nobody even noticed. Nobody got this far in the book. You know, it was more than 140 characters into the book, so that was it. It was the miss. But Back to the Future, what was ignored then is now at the center of the debates about how these social media sites shall develop. Wire just had this piece, which I was really happy I had nothing to do with, asking this question of Facebook, without allowing people to contribute to the commons, you're losing the value of the sharing web. And of course, the explosion around the terms of service, around the Instagram issue, all reflect the fact that this salience of this question of social justice produced by the reality that corporations are making their value on top of the individual labor of people has become central to the question of what the future of the net looks like. And when you frame it like this, it's a little bit surprising that the obvious answer to this question hasn't been adopted in this space the way it has been adopted elsewhere. Think, for example, in the context of the software layer of the internet, how this question has been addressed. So if we think about the greatest diplomat of the 20th century, I'm not thinking of this man, I'm thinking of this man. That's a joke for those of you who know. This is Richard Stallman. Richard Stallman, of course, sometimes vision like this, the prophet, the man who gave us the free software movement, which inspired many of the movements that eventually gave us GNU Linux, extraordinary important movement that produced most of the most important infrastructure technology for the internet. Very early in the development of this project, there was the question raised, would commercial entities be allowed to profit from this collective production? And there are a lot of possible answers to that question. But what Stallman said and embodied in the GNU operating system and then the principles of the Free Software Foundation was that there's a basic social contract here. And the basic social contract would be what he called copyleft. Go ahead and commercialize galore the stuff we produce. Take it and build on top of it and make as much money from it as you can, so long as you leave as free the stuff that you take as it had before and you contribute back the modifications you've made to the public once again. Keep it free, but commercialize on top of it. That's the architecture that produces companies like Red Hat to profit from the collective production of people voluntarily producing things like GNU Linux. They contribute back, but they also get to commercialize on top of it. That's the social contract free software had, and that's the same social contract that, for example, Wikipedia continues to embed in the context of their license that allows people to commercialize, but modifications must be licensed back freely. But when we move from the software layer, where this problem seems, in my view, to be solved, to the application and content layer, it's not yet been solved. We move to the internet, or if we bushify this a little bit, and we can see that we've got now the internets. The internets, because a decade ago, this was the picture of the internet, but today, increasingly, this is the picture of the internet, these islands of innovation, each of which embeds rules about the permission to own or build upon them. The only one that builds freedom into its island explicitly is in the context of Yahoo with Flickr, that explicitly allows people to license and open content in a way that guarantees its free use. And paradoxically, for old guys like me who remember the battles of the old days, the only one that exercises no control over innovation on its platform is Microsoft. And what's odd about that is, of course, you remember 1998 when a federal case was brought because of Microsoft's threat, alleged threat to cut off Netscape's air supply. Microsoft's decision, alleged decision, to stop a competitor from developing on its platform, or we could reframe it as Microsoft's decision to control who could develop on its platform. That decision triggered an antitrust case. Today, air supplies are cut off all the time. The reality of the internet is a reality of an innovation platform where the owners of the platform presumptively believe they have the right to control who gets to innovate on top of the platform and how. And as they exercise that control, we're increasingly seeing pushback from that control being exercised. Remember the revolt that happened around Twitter as Twitter tried to reassert control over how its API could be used, what applications would be permitted to be built on top of the API, inspiring a pushback expressed in what should be a familiar terminology. People being tired of being betrayed by so-called open platforms that suddenly change their terms of use and blithely destroy young and growing businesses. What this is a claim for the right to innovate on top of this platform and a criticism of the platform taking that right away. we should recognize. We have moved from a place where taking the right to innovate away was so fundamental and problematic that the federal government stepped in and questioned it, to a world where this right to control is the increasing and new normal. All right, so what's the point of this? Well, here is the point. Okay, the Hibrite economy is learning something. It's learning something about the limits. It's learning something about the limits of the ecology within which it lives. It's learning about the limits about what can be taken from those who are contributing to it. It's learning that sharecropping cannot be a way to understand what it does. It's not sustainable, it's not stable. And as it learns this, I think we should expect a certain kind of reform in the hybrid world. We could think hybrid reform here coming as this recognition of this question of the freedom of these contributors becomes an increasingly salient way in which these companies are questioned. Okay. Old, borrowed, let's get back to something new. All right, I told you about the cornucopia of the commons, this reality of public goods being produced as a byproduct of private goods, or more precisely, corporate goods being produced as a byproduct of individual goods. Here's the question. Are public goods only going to be produced as a byproduct of private goods? Is this our future? That the only goods, the only public goods that we will expect the world to produce are those that can be produced as a byproduct of these private goods. Obviously, there is a good that comes from what I want. That's the principle cornucopia of the commons teaches us. But I suggest there's also a good from what I ought to do. There's not just goods, not just from what I want. There's also a good that comes from I don't want, but I actually do. Or put it again, a good that comes not just from choice, but hard as this is to say in this part of the world, a good that comes from coercion. Now you say, oh, coercion? Lessig, how can you use such a word? And I confess, I grew up here in this land of libertarian love, where we embraced this concept of West Coast Code, and West Coast Code was all about enabling choice and freedom. And you suspect now I've moved back to the East Coast, and here on the East Coast we don't worry about freedom, we talk about coercion. What's happened, you wonder, and I gotta confess it's true. It feels a little bit Stalinist, I understand. But when I talk about coercion, I'm not talking about state-based coercion. I'm talking about the possible public goods that come from architecture-based coercions. Or we could say code-based constraints, kind of constraints that I talked about originally in the context of code. But I want you to think about code-based constraints that get us to do things that we might need to do, and that the public goods that would be produced by us just doing what we want to do will not provide. Now, this might mark me as a heretic. I get that. But it's a really cool dress the heretic gets to wear, so I'm okay with that right now. Okay, so here's the example I want you to think about. You can think of this as new version 2. All right. I want you to focus on a particular kind of problem, social problem. I want to introduce that social problem with a story. I'm told stories go like this. Once upon a time, there's a place called Lesterland. Okay, you don't know this because I keep this secret, so don't tell anybody, but my name is actually Lester. It's Lester Lawrence Lessig. I hide that as much as I can, so I'm allowed to make fun of Lesters, and I want to make fun of Lesters here. Lesterland. So Lesterland looks a lot like the United States, has about 310 million people like the United States, and like the United States, about 144,000 of these people are Lesters, meaning about 0.05% of the population of Lesterland is named Lester. Now, the thing about Leicesters in Leicesterland is that they have an interesting power. Leicesterland has a democracy which has two elections. One election is called the general election. The other election is called the Leicester election. The thing about the Leicester election is in the Leicester election, only Leicesters get to vote. But in the general election, all citizens get to vote. You know, if you're over 18, if you've got an ID in some states, but anyway, you get to vote if you're a citizen. But here's the trick. To be allowed to run in the general election, you as a candidate must do extremely well in the Leicester election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. Okay, so that's the picture of democracy in Leicesterland. Now, what can we say about Leicesterland? Well, I think we can say, number one, as the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, the people in Leicesterland have the ultimate influence over elected officials, the ultimate influence over elected officials, because after all, there is a general election. But they have that influence only after the Leicesters have had their way with the candidates who want to run and win in the general election. And number two, we can say, obviously, this dependence upon the Leicesters is going to produce a subtle, understated, camouflaged bending to keep the Leicesters happy. And number three, reform that angers the Leicesters in Leicesterland, we could say is highly unlikely. Okay, so that's Leicesterland. I want you to recognize three things about Leicesterland. Number one, the United States is Leicesterland. United States is Leicesterland. The United States also looks like this, also has two elections. One is called the general election. The other we should call the money election. In the general election, all citizens get to vote if you're 18, in some states if you have an ID. In the money election, it's the funders, the relevant funders of campaigns who get to vote. And as in Leicesterland, to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the Leicester election. You don't necessarily have to win. Jerry Brown shows us you don't have to win. But you must do extremely well. And here's the key. There are just as few relevant funders in the United States as there are Leicesters in Leicesterland. Now you say, really? 0.05%? Well, here are the numbers from this election. 0.3% of America gave more than $200 to any federal candidate in the last election. 0.055% gave the maximum amount to any candidate in the last election. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, gave $10,000 or more in the last election. 0.0003% gave $100,000 or more, and here's my favorite number, 0.00042%. For those of you doing the numbers, you know that's 132 Americans gave 60% of the super PAC money spent in the last presidential election cycle. So I'm a lawyer, you know, I look at 0.3, 0.055, 0.01. I think I'm entitled to say the relevant number of funders is about 0.05% of America. And I think I'm entitled to say then these funders are our Leicesters. Now, as we could say about Leicesterland, that means we can say these things about USA land. Number one, the Supreme Court's completely right. The people do have the ultimate influence over the elected officials in the United States, but they have that influence in the general election only after the funders have had their ways with the candidates who want to run in the general election. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the funders produces a subtle and understated, we could say camouflaged bending to keep these funders happy. Candidates for Congress and members of Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And as any of us would, as they do that, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000, Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. And then point number 3, reform that would anger these funders is, in our democracy, we could say highly unlikely. So that's the first point. The United States is Lesterland. Here's the second point. The United States is worse than Lesterland. Worse than Lesterland. Because in Lesterland, you can imagine if we Lesters got this letter from the government that said, you have been chosen to select the candidates who get to run in the general election, you can imagine that could inspire in us Lesters, that we come from all segments of society. There are black Lesters and white, but there aren't many women Lesters, but put that aside for a second. We come from all, we can imagine that we would be inspired to an aristocratic urge, the desire to act in the interest of the society as a whole. We'd pick the best candidates for you to select them on. It's at least possible that in Lesterland, the Lesters would act for the good of Lesterland. But in our land, in this land, in USA land, the Lesters act for the Lesters. Because the shifting coalition of interests that comprise the 0.055% is a shifting coalition driven by the issues that are just over the horizon. If global warming is the issue, you can be sure that coal companies and oil companies are among the Lesters. If it's healthcare reform, then insurance companies and doctors and pharmaceutical companies are among the Lesters. Whatever the issue is, that drives who the Lesters are, and these Lesters driving these funding decisions are not, in the main, driving to the public interest. In this sense, I want to say the United States is worse than Lesterland. And finally, point number 3, whatever one wants to say about Lesterland, in our land, in our Lesterland, in our USA land, this conflicting dependence on funders and the people is plain and simple corruption. Now, by corruption, I don't mean brown paper bag corruption, where cash is secreted among members of Congress. I don't mean Rob Blagojevich corruption. People are trading their power for personal gain. I'm not talking about any illegal activity at all. Indeed, everything I'm talking about, I'm willing to say, is completely legal under the system that we have allowed to evolve. Instead, what I'm talking about is not illegal corruption, it's legal corruption. And it's corruption relative to the framers' baseline that they had in mind when they created this republic. The framers gave us what they called a republic, but by a republic they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy they meant, as Federalist 52 puts it, a government that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. So here's their model of government. They have the people and they have the government. I do my own slides. It's cool the way that bounces like that, right? So the people and the government. An exclusive dependency, and so would the public good be found through that exclusivity. But here's the problem. We have allowed Congress to evolve a different dependence. No longer just a dependence upon the people, it is increasingly a dependence upon the funders too. This is a dependence too. But it's a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone, so long as the funders are not the people. This is corruption, and this corruption has an effect. Its first effect is to lead Americans to believe, and it's a separate question. I think Americans are right to believe, but put that aside for a second. Americans believe, quote unquote, money buys results in Congress. According to a poll we conducted for a book that was I published last fall, 75% of Americans affirm money buys results in Congress. A little bit higher Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing. We Americans all believe money buys results in Congress. Leading to point number 2, that belief erodes trust in the institution of Congress. Last year, ABC and the New York Times reported that 9% of America has confidence in Congress. Later poll just this last month found 5% of America had confidence in Congress. Who is that 5%? I don't understand. 9%, 5%. Here's the thing we can be absolutely confident about. Put it in context. At the time of the American Revolution, a higher percentage of Americans had confidence in the British Crown than have confidence in our Congress today. And that leads to point number 3. That erosion erodes participation. Rock the Vote, which organizes and turns out young voters, and in 2008 turned out the largest number of young voters ever to vote. We don't have the final numbers for 2012 yet. Found in 2010 a significant number of their new voters were not going to vote, so they polled them to ask them why. Their number one reason by far, 2-to-1 over the second highest reason, was, quote, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change, so why waste my time? And it's not just kids. The vast majority of people who could have voted in 2010 did not vote, in part at least because of this belief. And in this last election, 40% of those who could have voted did not vote, in part at least because of this belief. And finally, point number 4. Go back to the parenthetical Americans are right. In what sense are Americans right that money buys results in Congress? Well, let's focus on the results. What are the results that the Lesters want? The Lesters in our system. In the context of climate change, in the context of pharmaceutical pricing, in the context of Wall Street regulation, what are the results that these Lesters want? The critical thing to recognize is what they want is nothing. They want not a thing. What they want is to stop anything from happening. They want to stop change. They want the status quo. They want to stop change because change here doesn't pay. If coal companies or oil companies had to pay for the externality they impose on the rest of us by spreading carbon in our environment, they would lose an enormous amount of the profits which they currently have. So it doesn't pay for change to happen. They want to block change. If pharmaceutical companies had to compete for the provision on price of pharmaceutical drugs to government purchases, the way they had to in Veterans Affairs but don't have to for other government purchase, they would be paid less. They don't like that. They want to keep the world the way it is right now. If Wall Street couldn't externalize the gambling risk that they take when they gamble with these big banks and the securities which they play the markets with, knowing we will back them out if they fail, they would not make the profits that they make. They don't want the change. All of these Lesters want to block the change, the reform that these areas of policy require, and we have allowed a system to evolve in which it is trivially easy to block change. Polarization and the structure of our constitutional separation of powers of government means it is trivially easy to buy no as an answer from our government, producing what we should recognize as an instability, a deep irrationality inside of a system where 0.05% have the ability to block reform because 0.05% are effectively funding the elections. This instability, this irrationality will survive so long as a system is targeted, focused on this money. It is this sense in which this system, then, in my view, has been corrupted. Okay, I said I want you to focus on a particular kind of problem. That's the problem. The problem is not that there's money in politics, not that there's a lot of money in politics. The problem is a system where the candidates spend an extraordinary amount of time raising money from the tiniest slice of us. That's the problem. And if that's the problem, there's an obvious solution. If it's a systemic problem, the funders are not the people. The systemic solution is to make it so the funders are the people. To give them away, it looks like I'm saying give Congress away. Nobody would take Congress. So I don't mean that. What I mean is give Congress one way to fund their campaigns without Faust, without selling their soul and thereby alienating most of America. And the one way I increasingly think the only way to do this is to embrace what we should call citizen-funded campaigns. But if you remember, if you think back to the early part of the Republic and think about voting, it used to be in the voting election, a particular slice of us had extraordinarily large influence relative to the rest of us. At the founding, the people who had the right to vote were white male property owners. They had enormous power in the voting election. The rest of the people didn't. And what progress over the last 200 years has meant was finding ways to make sure that the voting power was relatively equalized across all segments of our society. By giving black men the right to vote, then giving women the right to vote, and then guaranteeing that poll taxes didn't mean the poor people didn't have the right to vote. And the solution here is to do the same with this other election, the money election, where right now the 1% have 10 times per capita the influence that the bottom 99% have combined, 10 to 1. Progress here would be to find a way to make relatively equal the influence every segment of our society has in that election, just like they have absolute equality in the voting election. And that's what citizen-funded campaigns do. These are systems to allow small dollar contributions to fund campaigns. These are government-funded systems. So candidates get to opt into a system where they take small contributions only, but those contributions then get amplified so that you can afford to win campaigns taking small contributions only. You can afford to run campaigns where you never take money from the lesters, or if you take money from the lesters, you're taking money from the lesters and the rest of us too. Now, there are many different versions of this. There are matching fund versions of this. There are voucher programs for this. Oregon has a tax credit version of this. But the key is to see all of these different versions have the same objective, to fund campaigns from the bottom up, so that each of them has the objective of removing the gap between the funders and the people. That's what I mean as citizen-funded campaigns. Only citizens are funding campaigns, and all citizens are funding campaigns. And if we could imagine a Congress so funded, whose campaigns were so funded with small dollar contributions only, then we all could believe, as we all desperately want to believe, that whenever Congress did something stupid, it was either because there were too many Republicans or too many Democrats, but it wouldn't be because of the money, because we would have removed this cynical assumption from the calculation by making it implausible for anybody to believe that money was driving a result, since money would be spread as thinly and broadly as votes are spread right now. That, in my view, is the solution. But that begs an obvious question. Is it even possible to imagine this solution being enacted? Is it even possible? I'm not talking about constitutional possibility. I'm talking about political possibility. And my skepticism about its possibility of being enacted was taught to me by this man, Jim Cooper, a Democrat from Tennessee, who's been in Congress as long as about 20 other members of Congress. So a senior member of Congress who said, you've got to understand, the problem with Capitol Hill is that Capitol Hill has become a kind of, quote, farm league for K Street. K Street where all the lobbyists work. So what he's saying here is that members of Congress and staffers and bureaucrats have an increasingly common business model. A business model that's focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. Public Citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004, 50% of the Senate left to become lobbyists, 42% of the House. Those numbers have only gone up, and as United Republic calculated last April, the average salary increase for the members who they tracked leaving Congress, going to lobbyist firms, was 1,452%. So in a world where everyone depends on the system as it is surviving, it's a fair question to ask. How is it possible we could imagine them changing the system? That's the obvious question. But if that's the obvious question, here in Silicon Valley, we think there's an obvious opportunity. The opportunity looks like, well, this old version of the internet. And this is an opportunity because of a dynamic that has developed that's increasingly obvious in the way politics in America happens. Most in the Chatterati think the interesting division in American politics is between the left side and the right side. I think the interesting division in American politics is between the inside and the outside. So the inside that beltway called Washington, D.C., and the outside, the rest of America. And when you listen to what they think about and what they care about and compare it to what the rest of America thinks about and cares about, it begs to remix this title a little bit. DC is from Mars, and we are from Earth. Now, this inside-outside suggests for each of them a particular kind of politics. And following Nigel Cameron, we can think about outside politics as a kind of exo-politics. And it's distinctive. It's particular. It's not a politics of politicians. These are not wannabe congressmen that are involved in this exo-political movements. These are citizen politicians, people who don't want to become elected but want to participate in changing the government, citizens demanding that politics change. And when you look back over the last 15 years or so, what you see is increasing frequency of these waves of what's self-described as, quote, open source political energy. There are many of these. They're increasingly frequent. I think of the first of them in 1998 coming from MoveOn. If you remember MoveOn in 1998, started by two Berkeley programmers who one day looked up from their screen and noticed the United States Congress was about to impeach a man for lying about sex. And they said, this is ridiculous. There are a lot of problems America faces right now, and this is nowhere on the top 10,000 list. So what they said is, we need to get a movement to tell Congress to censure the man for his terribly inappropriate and maybe illegal behavior, but then to move on to address the rest of the issues that America needs to address. And within a couple weeks, they had assembled millions of people on this list, Democrats and Republicans alike, who insisted that Congress move on, and it radically changed the dynamic of how Washington thought about this issue that seemed, at least inside the Beltway, to be an obvious winner for one party and an obvious loser for the other. I think the Tea Party, as it was birthed in 2009, before it was taken over by insider Republicans, was also a kind of exo-political movement, enabled by the internet, self-described as an open source movement, facilitating these thousands of groups from around the country to organize and to demand a particular version of change that I wouldn't support, but still a version of change that was enabled and empowered by this politics. I think the Occupy movement in 2011 was an exo-political movement. I think the movement in 2012 that stopped SOPA and PIPA, to the complete surprise of the Hollywood lobbyists who believed that they had an absolute slam dunk lined up in Washington, was an exo-political movement. The active movement that spread across Europe is an exo-political movement. Even the movement that is insisting upon the right to remix, of course inspired by my book right here, but this thing, Recht auf Remix, that means the right to remix. Can you imagine in Germany they're arguing, they're standing, they're protesting for a right to remix because, of course, they don't have a fair use right that then gives them the freedom that we have in the United States. This is a kind of power. It is ground up power. It is new. It is maybe new, but if there is hope here for this change, this is the hope, this exo-political movement. But here's the problem, or we should say another problem. This exo-political movement is increasingly, in familiar ways, polarized. Like everybody in our political society. Politicians, political parties, the media, even the .orgs trying to remake our society, they practice this business model of polarization. A business model that teaches them that they profit most the more they divide us. The more they teach us to hate them, the more loyal followers they'll have to them in opposition to us. Now, this is a kind of, we could say, Ray-Ban culture that we've produced here, polarized but extremely cool. But the problem is that with the changes we're talking about, the fundamental changes needed to address the thing I said was the problem, the corruption of this government, polarization fails. With these changes, to attack this cancer that is the life inside that beltway, it must be not a polarized political movement on the left or the right, but a cross-partisan movement. By which I don't mean a kind of kumbaya, bipartisan movement where we pretend we all agree. We don't all agree. What I mean is a movement that somehow finds a way to cut across partisan lines. And my view is we cannot win this fight against this corruption if the movement is polarized, if it is divided like that. Okay, but then that brings back the question. The question that Brickland's framework sets up? Can the cornucopia unite us? Can it help us get around this polarization? And here, when I think of Bricklin, I also think of a brick wall. Because when I think about the mechanism of internet activism, the way it actually works at the grassroots, at the ground up, this peer-to-peer activism has a certain character. If it does produce public goods as a byproduct of private goods, then the byproduct is a byproduct of me doing what I like to do. And what I like to do is to rally people like me. People like me, people who agree. I want to get us together, which means people at my particular pole. This is a good technology for us getting together, but it doesn't suggest it's a good technology to the problem of polarization. Indeed, it could be exacerbating the polarization. And so what we need here is some way to get beyond what I want, or we need a sense of I want in the sense of I want my broccoli, or I want to pay more taxes, or I want to volunteer to fight in a war, or I want to be the man who runs up the steps at the World Trade Center to put out a fire. Right? What we need here is not anything that dramatic. We need something even smaller, but even harder, I think, to imagine with ordinary people in the context of this peer-to-peer activism. What we need is a want to say, I'm willing to make my friends uncomfortable. But that's extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. So what we need then is a different sense of want. What we need is a sense of sacrifice. The sense that is at the core of the meaning of citizen. But the question that I mean this talk to ask is whether the internet has done this. Do we have examples of the internet inspiring this sense of sacrifice? Or can the internet do this? Can this system of perfect choice, frictionless system of perfect choice, ever create the structure that induces people to do not what they want at their first level, but what they think they need to want for lots of other reasons of sacrifice? Because there are lots of examples of public goods being produced as a byproduct of private goods, but are there any examples of private good being sacrificed to this public good? Because the movement to fight this corruption is, I think, unlike any we've seen since perhaps the civil rights movement, since perhaps the progressive movement. It's a movement that requires the sacrifice and discomfort unlike any we've ever seen, most likely to be unliked by most who confront it. Now, this leads me to a certain kind of envy for cruder times, for cruder technologies. 1969, 50% of America watched one of 3 news programs every night. And the architecture of that media infrastructure required that those news programs shoot right down the middle and cover a wide range of information. And it covered some information like this: civil rights protests, thrust in the middle of evening discussions. Whether you wanted it or not, it was there. And when it was thrust like that, it wasn't the product of a choice. I'm going to tune into the discussion about civil rights protests. It was a certain kind of coercion that put it there. It was the coercion of imperfect architectures of access, unchosen architectures of communication. They had the effect of producing what we could think of as the broccoli of information, exposing us to things we otherwise would not have been exposed to, and thereby changing our opportunities for thinking about these things. And what that meant is that the leaders of those movements knew that we would hear what they said, regardless of who we were. The only question they then had to solve for was, could they make us listen to them? And to do that required a certain discipline. And that discipline came out of a fight that occurred at the early part of the civil rights movement between two camps. One camp associated with Malcolm X, whose view was the way to rally people and get them out and to turn up to protest was to make them extremely angry, furious at the injustice that they had suffered for hundreds of years in the United States. And if violence was a byproduct of that, then so be it. It had to be focused and angry to get people excited to come out. The equivalent of the polarization battles we see today. But on the other side was a view associated with Martin Luther King, who said, look, if we can get 14% of America to show up, we're not going to win. 14% is not enough. Instead, we need to figure a way that we can speak so that others can hear us. So that rather than meeting violence with violence, we have to surprise them. We have to meet violence with nonviolence. And when they see us reacting nonviolently to police violence, they'll stop. They'll watch it on their television screens because Walter Cronkite shows it to them, and they'll think and they'll listen. And they may change their mind. And I think here, too, we need that discipline. We need to figure a way to speak so that others can hear. We need to focus on a message that all sides can hear. And I do believe focusing on this message of corruption is such a frame. This picture of what's wrong with our government is, I believe, the only frame that can unite people like that with people like this. Two radically different segments of our society, I think, can stand focused on this common enemy. I don't believe this frame inspires all segments of our society in the same way. It is this, the corruption. But our problem is the reverse of the problem of the civil rights movement. I think to this message, the world would listen. But we have so spread, nichified the media infrastructure that we have right now. The fundamental question we have now is not whether they would listen, it's whether they could even hear. Because there is no place that they all come where we can speak and they can listen. So, we have an infrastructure that's good for us rooting for the home team. Not so good to speak and engage or persuade the enemy. And then what's the point of this? Well, here's the point. Again, we can see there are limits to this infrastructure. But these are not the limits of what can be taken, which were the limits I said existed with the Hibrite economy. These are the limits of what will be given by the peer-to-peer participants in this infrastructure of politics. Limits of what can be given, recognizing a gap, what we could call the sacrifice gap, recognizing the internet will not yet give us everything we might need to repair a republic. Not everything will be fixed by this net, or at least not yet. Because I'm sure once I mention this as a problem with the internet next week, somebody from the MediaX team will have solved it. So that's why I'm here, to talk about it, to get you to solve it by next week. Okay. Let me say one more thing before we end. I told you something old, something new, something borrowed, now something blue. This isn't precisely what's blue, though it will strike some of you as blue. Al Gore's my hero. Still is my hero. I know he's controversial, but he's still my hero. Here's what Al Gore had to say at a TED conference recently.
I'm a big advocate of changing the light bulbs and buying hybrids, and Tipper and I put 33 solar panels on our house and dug the geothermal wells and done all of that other stuff. But as important as it is to change the light bulbs, it's more important to change the laws. And when we change our behavior in our daily lives, we sometimes leave out the citizenship part and the democracy part. In order to be optimistic about this, we have to become incredibly active as citizens in our democracy. In order to solve the climate crisis, we have to solve the democracy crisis.
Okay, so Al is talking about the same thing I'm talking about, the gap, the commitment gap between us doing what feels good for us and doing what doesn't feel so good to solve this democracy crisis. the crisis we need to solve if we're ever to address climate change problems, or get a healthcare system that's rational or sensible, or to address the questions of financial misregulation, or to address this extraordinary ballooning problem of the debt, the democracy crisis. But the way I talk about it, I'd not quite call it the democracy crisis, I'd call it the republic crisis. It's the crisis caused by allowing Lesterland to invade us. Ben Franklin, when he was carried from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, was stopped in a street in Philadelphia and asked by a woman, "Mr. Franklin, what have we wrought?" Mr. Franklin responded, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it. A republic, a representative democracy, a government dependent upon the people alone." We have lost that republic. We have to act to get it back, but the challenge is how can we act to get it back? The tool du jour is this network, or these networks. But the problem I see is these may not be made for this problem. They might not be enough. And this is the blue fact, because this is the only tool we have. Thank you very much. Do you have an answer question? Sure. So I'm happy to take questions or abuse. Yeah.
I agree with everything you said, very entertaining. There's one institution you didn't mention, the Supreme Court. So it seems to be dead set blocking this passage. And they don't face the impediments of re-election that you talk about, or prospect of pastry. How do you view their role in your vision?
Yeah, so my view is there are two things people are obsessed about that are distractions. One is the Supreme Court, and the other is the presidential election. The Supreme Court does not, even in its craziest moments, say anything that would throw into doubt Congress's power to create the kind of funding system that I was talking about. That's perfectly constitutional. Indeed, in the latest Supreme Court opinion addressing this Arizona case, the court explicitly said, of course, public funding systems like voucher matching systems, perfectly constitutional. They've decided a series of cases in ways that I think are completely crazy, but we don't have to fix that in order to address this issue. And the more important point is, if we fixed that, people are out there saying we ought to get an amendment to the Constitution that says corporations are not persons. If we had that amendment tomorrow, nothing of the corruption that I've described would change. It would still be the case that the tiniest fraction of the 1%, 1 out of 2,000, were funding elections. So I don't talk about the Supreme Court because I think people obsess about it too much. I also don't talk about the presidency because even if we had the very best president, and some people think we do, without a Congress that's free of this corruption, we can't address that issue. So I'm trying to get people to narrow down on what is the core dynamic that creates the problem, and it is the Lesterland dynamic, and I want to focus on what are the mechanisms to get people to push for a kind of solution to the Lesterland dynamic I think we've got.
Martin Luther King had a dream on the other side of the struggle. Part of what seems to be to make it hard for us is we do not have a vision of what lies on the other side of the struggle.
Well, I guess I think we have a vision. It just doesn't seem as beautiful as Martin Luther King's, right? So I think if we perfected our democracy, we would still have a pretty badly functioning system of government. We're not going to have utopia. We're not going to have perfectly rational decisions made by the government. We're not going to have a bunch of, Platonic guardians who are, genius philosopher, whatever. God forbid we had academics in government, but whatever. The point is, we're not going to create utopia. So it's not very inspiring. But I think what we can create is a government where it's no longer rational for people to say, there's no reason for me to care, to participate, to do anything about it, because I'm not a Lester. Makes no sense for me to get out and try to organize, as the Rock the Vote people found. It makes no sense to go out and vote, because regardless of who I vote for, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. We can take that fact away. We can make it so there is no tiny, tiny slice of the 1% that actually has this extraordinary power, and get us back to a place where it's just now the struggle of democracy, which is not a happy struggle, which is not necessarily a great struggle, but it's the sort of struggle that we have embedded in the core of what our government should be like. I think that, you can be inspired in the positive sense or inspired in the negative sense. I'm inspired in the negative sense. If we don't solve that problem, if we do not fix the government in this way, there is not one single important issue the United States faces that it will address in a rational, sensible way. Global warming? No chance. Healthcare system that's not the most expensive in the world, yet delivers poor healthcare? No chance. Right? Reform of Wall Street? We had the worst crisis since the Depression. No fundamental change in the structural instability that created that crisis. So you go down the list, internet, policy, copyright policy, whatever the issue is you care about, sensible solution will not come from this government. It cannot come from this government. If we don't, it's not as if we can choose not to address these issues, right? There are other countries that address these issues. They do have sensible policy making in certain areas. And if we can't, and if we don't, this republic crashes. It just crashes. So, you can be inspired by a beautiful picture or inspired by fear. And I'm inspired by fear here. 3 young kids who I'm handing over a future to that is radically worse than anything that I inherited from my parents.
Wow, I'm kind of depressed now.
Sorry.
I want to turn a little bit from the fear, which I do think motivates people, to the hope part of it. I think that you do a really good job articulating this idea of legalized corruption, and you have some really great ideas, some of the best ideas, I think, for solving it. So I definitely recommend everyone pay attention to him. But, for the last few years, I've been doing most of it. What I wanted to know is, all this money does have influence. I wanted to know of what I think is a complementary way to solve the problem, which I haven't heard so much of you speak about, which is that money that has all this influence, that ultimately comes from all of us. The money that goes to the companies, the money that goes to the wealthy people who are having the influence on these elections. I wanted to know what your thoughts were on projects like the Open Label Project, or just in general, what you think about mobile and mobile's ability for people to spread information so that they have more knowledge about where their money's going.
Well, who could be against it? Of course, absolutely. But what the reason not to believe that's alone going to be enough is that I don't think it's rational for people to care about what's going on in a world where there is Lesterland. It's not rational. Why would you waste your money? You got kids, you got a job, you got family, whatever. So you've got to give people a reason to believe there's something to get engaged for.
Could you just make it super easy? Is that part of it?
Yeah, you make it super easy. We can all understand everything, but still the dynamic of Lesterland means that they have a trumping influence on the structure of what gets done, right? So, and it's not just in the, Lesterland actually simplifies it because, if you live in, if you watch DC right now, there's a fantastic paper just published by Public Campaign, which I think finally focuses in a really effective way on how this mechanism works. And what they say is that what the fundraising mechanism does is sell the ability to obstruct. And they have this paper about Mitch McConnell, who is one of the most successful fundraisers in Washington. And they have 10 different examples of Mitch McConnell using the power in the Senate to create filibuster conditions to block things And then around his activity, a couple days before, a couple days activity, after, hundreds of thousands of dollars from the interest he benefited coming into his campaigns. And you can see it's trivially easy for the institution to hand out these gifts because all it's doing is blocking change from happening, and you can do that given our structure of government. So if we had all the information in the world about how terrible things were, but that still happened, I just want to know what we can do short of fixing the structure that makes it so that stuff happens. And so that's why, I'm not talking about the only reform our republic needs. I'm talking about the first reform our republic needs. Like after we get this reform, there's about 10 others. But we got to figure what's the generative, to use a Zittrain-like idea, what's the generative reform? What is the reform that makes others easier? And I'm all for finding ways to make easy sharing of information, understanding, and the business of root strikers is trying to recruit people to the task of teaching other people about this in a way that motivates them. But it's the thing we're motivated to do that I think has to happen first. That is to change the structure of this corruption.
The question is regarding the issue of corruption. And I have to tell a story about a year ago, my 8-year-old told me, we were watching Liberty Kids, and he asked me, Dad, who is a representative? No clue. And that was really amazing for me that I didn't know, because I think that I know a little bit about politics, but I didn't know. And a couple months later, I saw a documentary in Netflix, I guess Erosion, I don't know, I see too many documentaries. And it was Washington say that the Congress should not, the representative in Congress should not represent more than 3,000 persons. And I find out that there is hundreds of thousands of persons that a Congress, my congressman represent about 200,000 or 400,000.
700,000.
Okay, impossible. So, because you say, if we fix the issue of the founders, that we, the people, are the founders, there still is going to be an issue of the selection of the candidate before they are the candidates. Isn't it the problem of representation? And I think the internet, we could say, 3,000 or probably 10,000 would be okay because we have the internet. My community, Los Gatos, 10,000 people, should have a representative. I would know my neighbor. The Castro, I live in the Castro in the San Francisco, the same. I mean, the Castro, district should have its representative. I think it's a problem of representation because with the use of the internet, we won't have to have, all those congressmen in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. So again, I think this is another version of. I want to give an answer to another version of the answer that I just gave, which is, I do agree that government has become too far from the people. So more representative or different structure of representative would be great. And when you see governments, like I was in Vermont for amendment weekends and meeting with the leaders of the Vermont government, and the dynamic is just different. Vermont is a small state. Members of the legislature are neighbors. People know them. They're like friends. There's a kind of level of trust and understanding which creates a dynamic which is healthy for a democracy. That's right. So I completely agree with you. But again, the question is, what do we have to change first? Because the structure that we've got right now, driven by fundraising, is going to make the move to what you're talking about practically impossible to even conceive. They don't want to multiply the number of campaigns they're going to have to raise money for. Right? So this is just a non-starter because it would require constitutional reform, fundamental reform. And so I think it would be easier if the change that I was talking about happened first. So I want to see this change to enable discussion about others that I think are just as important. But it's because I think one enables the other that I pick it first.
Hello. I listened in on the con that you organized with a member, one of the founding, I forget his name. Remember, what was his name?
Mark Meckler.
Mark Meckler, yeah. And
he was a founder of the Tea Party Patriots.
Tea Party, right. And I found it interesting that at the end, it seemed to me that you were pleading with this guy to acknowledge that there was a problem with money in government, and he wouldn't acknowledge it. He was saying, no, I don't think it's a big problem. We just have to get government smaller, so there won't be enough money to cause people, for the bribes or whatever. So, I mean, I think there are two radically different versions, incompatible versions of what America is about. And one of those visions is that, people should be allowed to use all the money they want. That's just freedom. That's a libertarian view, and it's incompatible with I think, what your goal is. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so there are these radically different views, and when you confront them, it makes one feel, it makes someone who, like me, is typically pretty pessimistic, super pessimistic. And there's a conversation to have with people like Meckler. Indeed, I think Meckler today does believe that the money is a corrupting influence and has taken a position that says he supports the idea of bottom-up grassroots funding like the voucher program. So there's progress. But I don't want to deny the sense in which it feels hopelessly depressing to imagine bringing people around, let alone bringing the government. And if you have to confront and accept the fact it's hopelessly depressing, why do it? Why do it?
No, but one must acknowledge that there is this dichotomy in what Americans think this country is about. If you don't acknowledge that, you're not going to have that.
I agree. I acknowledge it. I do think there's a conversation that gets them to see that when we're talking about corruption, the other side doesn't believe corruption is a part of what the country's about. Indeed, I would say I would engage in this debate in the way that Tea Party people would frame it. What would the framers of our Constitution say about a system where the tiniest fraction of the 1% exercise dominating control over influence? They would say it's a corrupt government. A corrupt government. They would not ratify it. They would not support it. They would remedy it. So I don't think there's ultimately a gap, but I think there's a struggle to get people to the place where they see it. And the struggle is exactly the struggle I was talking about with the architectural polarization that we have in our society. What is this context in which to have that conversation? What was striking about that event you're talking about was that we set it up as this experiment to see whether Tea Party people and liberal people could sit in the same room and have a conversation. And it was a hopeful event. Meckler started by saying, the politicians profit the more they teach us to hate each other. And we've got to find a way to teach ourselves not to hate each other and to talk. So we agree on the structure of the problem, we agree on the modes, but it's incredibly difficult. And I got, I write about this at the end of my book. I write about maybe you think I did finish my thought. Okay. Go ahead, ask the question, and maybe I'll get this thought in with your question too.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt this. I just wanted to know if these tools, as you say, are not effective enough to address the government corruption, wouldn't our efforts be better spent in more effectively addressing their decisions, like Sokopipa? I mean, wouldn't we better be focusing on making our crowdsourcing platforms or even public shaming platforms more effective?
Yeah, so when Sokopipa happened, the community thought we had built the button, the big red button. We just had to push this button and the internet would respond. And so there was a whole series of issues that came up after Sokopipa that, don't get me wrong, I believe that the copyright issues are really important, but I don't believe they're the most important issues in the world, right? So when these other more important issues came up, people pressed the red button, and the internet didn't respond. So you could say, well, maybe we should try to build these mechanisms so they do respond. And I think the problem is that the most we can hope they will respond to is a tiny fraction of the place where government has got to be making sensible decisions. Maybe we'll get we can reform 5%, maybe 10%. But there's 90% left where the government's making fundamental important decisions which if there isn't a structure of incentives for them getting it right, they won't get right. Or more precisely, if there's a structure of incentives to have them sell out to obstructionism, they will continue to sell out to obstructionism. So you got to push them back to getting to the right structure of incentives. Now, so here I'm going to pretend like I'm extending an answer to your question in order to get back to the other question which I wanted. So I understand the appeal to thinking, oh my God, this is exactly what Silicon Valley does. It's like, oh my God, it's hopeless to imagine fixing Washington. So I got this great new idea for a platform that we can use to get people rallied and go out and to fix things. So it's always about how do we build the technology, putting aside the question that maybe we've also got to address the policy. I once saw Eric Schmidt speak, extraordinary, speaker, extraordinary vision, unbelievable ideas that Google's working on. I'm blown away by every single one of them. And then I asked him about this issue, and it was the first small idea he uttered, was his ideas for how to deal with this issue, because it's clear that he doesn't want to think about that problem, because it seems so impossible to him. And it is rationally impossible. But rather than turning away from the impossibility, I think we have to embrace the impossibility. And as I was saying, at the end of my book, I talk about this experience of speaking at Dartmouth, and a woman stood up and she said, Professor, you've absolutely convinced me. It is completely hopeless. There's nothing we can do. Nothing we can do. And as I describe in the book, when she said this to me, I kind of blown away, but pushed back. And I had, for some reason, I haven't had a chance to talk to my shrink about yet, had this image come to my head of my son, who was then 6. And I thought, well, what if a doctor came to me and said, your son has terminal brain cancer and there's nothing you can do. And I thought, would I do nothing? Is that it? I would just say, okay. Of course, no. You would do everything. And what that gets you to recognize is what love means, right? What love means is the odds are irrelevant. Odds are irrelevant. You do whatever you can. And that then led to the recognition that, even we liberals love our country. We love our country. And it's the same understanding of love here that we need. Love of country means the odds are irrelevant. The impossibility is irrelevant. You identify this is what you need to do. The rational policymakers or calculators will tell you it can't be done. You say, thank you. That's very interesting. I don't care. I'm not going to let it die. I don't have the right to pass down a broken America. I don't have that right. I inherited something. I have to do everything I can do. You have to do everything you can do. You have to look up from the machine. Look up from the machine and recognize we need you. We need you in particular. Because this is the only part of the world where the idea of a change that radically changes the world is daily conversation. You do it all the time. So take your 20% and do it on this problem too. Because we can't afford not to solve this problem. We can't afford it. Thanks very much.